Oh, sure. And take it away, Mr. Gayler.
All right. Well, it's good to be joining you all tonight, and I'm a new member of Crew, and so thank you for that. It's been a pleasure, and it was certainly nice working with Susanna for the time I did. I'll get into it. This is probably a little bit of a strange topic, but my topic is how the history of the nation of Israel convinced me of the reliability of the Bible. And, I thought I'd start with Nostradamus. And a lot of people know about Nostradamus, and I thought I'd read one of his prophecies. It says, "The great man will be struck down in the day by a thunderbolt. The evil deed predicted by the bearer of the petition. According to the prediction, another falls at night." Can anyone guess what that prophecy has to do with? That is a very vague prophecy that apparently predicted the death of John F. Kennedy. I mean, even knowing that, I don't necessarily make the connection. But anyway, a lot of people have looked at Nostradamus and thought how amazing that he could predict some of these things. Before I can get into what is convincing me about biblical truth according to the nation of Israel, I wanted to start with a little bit of history. The nation of Israel was practically born in slavery. Abraham was called on to leave his homeland in the land of Ur in the Middle East, and he went and traveled, and one of his grandsons was named Jacob. Eventually, Jacob's name was changed to Israel, and from that man came the nation. And Israel had 12 sons. His favorite was Joseph, and that made Joseph's brothers pretty jealous, and they rather hated him for it. And so they sold him as a slave, and he was taken down to Egypt. While in Egypt, he rose to prominence there because of his wisdom and his ability to interpret dreams. And so Joseph in Egypt rose to the second in command right under Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And so he was aware, he became aware through interpreting a dream of the Pharaoh that there was going to be 7 years of great prosperity and 7 years of famine. And so the Pharaoh put him in charge of gathering goods and storing them and rationing out things so that they would be taken care of. During the heat of this famine, his brother, Joseph's brothers, still up north of Egypt, finally became desperate and had to come to Egypt for food. They acted like Joseph had been killed. They told their father he'd been killed. They eventually go to Egypt to get grain, to get food, and eventually move there. And they were welcomed by the Egyptians. And it was a small family at that point. Fast forward hundreds of years, they're a great nation in Egypt. And as they grew, the Egyptians began to get a little nervous about this large gathering of foreigners in their land, and began to worry about what that might mean. And so they began to enslave them. And they enslaved the Jewish people, the Israelites, down in Egypt. At about 430 years, the Jewish people left Egypt and went wandering in the wilderness for about 40 years. And then they went into the land of Canaan and took that as their own and began to grow as a nation there in the land of Canaan. They started to have some problems with each other. And so there were the 10 tribes of the north, which were called Israel, and they split off from the 2 tribes of the south called Judah, and began to have some trouble. And there were many attempts to destroy the nation of Israel, both Israel and Judah. First of all the way back in Egypt, there was a time where they were trying to get rid of them and threw all the babies in the Nile River, began to make their work harder as slaves, and to try to run them out and run them down. Later, the Assyrians came down and conquered Israel, the 10 tribes, took them and scattered them all over the Middle East, and took people from other areas and put them in the land of Israel and scattered them. About 150 years later, the Babylonians came and they conquered the southern kingdom of Judah and took them and scattered them. They took them into exile, into Babylon, and kept them captive there for 70 years. Even while in exile, some Jewish people were held in Persia. And while in Persia, a jealous government official named Haman set a date and had the king sign off on it for the murder of all the Jewish people in Persia. Little did he know the queen was Jewish. And so she was able to get the king to change his mind, and they survived. But fast forward to the times of the Roman Empire, and King Herod, due to concerns of a threat to his reign, ordered all the boys under 2 to be murdered, under 2 years old. And finally, in AD 70, the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple and ran them out. Basically, they were scattered all over the world, taken to all corners, all areas of the world. And the question occurred to me, how could this tiny nation, already very small, scattered all over the world, how could they maintain their identity over thousands of years and then come back together? That, as far as I know, that's never happened in any other circumstance, that especially a people that small and low in number. And so this is where the Bible comes in. I read the Bible sometimes, and I began to read in the old prophets of the Holy Bible, and I began to see a common theme throughout. And I'm just going to read 4 passages from the prophets from thousands of years ago. Isaiah was a prophet who was prophesying about the future of Israel before they went into Babylonian captivity. And it says in Isaiah chapter 11, verses 11 and 12, "And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria and from Egypt and from Pathros and from Cush and from Elam and from Shinar and from Hamath and from the islands of the sea. And he shall set up a banner for the nations and shall assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the 4 corners of the earth." And in Jeremiah 29:14, it says, "I will be found of you, saith the Lord, and I will turn away your captivity, and I will gather you from all the nations and from all the places whither I have driven you, saith the Lord, and I will bring you again into the place whence I caused you to be carried away captive." In Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 41, it says, "I will accept you with your sweet savor when I bring you out from the people and gather you out of the countries wherein you have been scattered, and I will be sanctified in you before the heathen. And ye shall know that I am the Lord when I shall bring you into the land of Israel, into the country for the which I lifted up my hand to give it to your fathers." And finally, Deuteronomy chapter 30 and verse 3. "That then the Lord thy God will turn thy captivity and have compassion upon thee, and will return and gather thee from all the nations whither the Lord God hath scattered thee. If any of thine be driven out into the utmost parts of heaven, from thence will the Lord thy God gather thee, and from thence will he fetch thee. And the Lord thy God will bring thee into the land which thy fathers possessed, and thou shalt possess it, and he will do good to thee and multiply thee." So I began to see in all these prophets over and over again, thousands of years ago, they say that God is going to bring back Israel into that land that they inhabited thousands of years ago. In 1948, the state of Israel was once again recognized by most of the world, and that being a partial fulfillment of prophecy. But many of the prophecies speak of a time when Israel will dwell in peace. And Israel hasn't had much of a peaceful period, but that time has not come yet. But based on the absurdity the unlikeliness and the near impossibility that a prophecy of this tiny nation from thousands of years ago, that they would come back together, maintain their identity, and inhabit their land, if that came true, then it gives me confidence that the other prophecies in the Bible will also come true. I thank you for your time.